Today I want to talk about some of the challenges you face working with trickier fabrics. Fabrics that are embellished or have beads or sequins or embroidery. And on my cutting table today I have a selection of garments that I'm working on at the moment. Some are bespoke, some are restoration projects, and some are collaborations with TV and stage companies. So let's just have a look at some of them. Here we have a flat sequence which is fixed onto a stretch tool. Here we have some more flat sequence which is in a sheer presentation. Here we have a pleated fabric. Now this is interesting because you see it has this little dotted Swiss effect on it over tulle, and it's pleated on the cross grain. You can see the salvage here. One of the salvage edges is quite finished. The other salvage edge has a different finish on it, and it kind of disappears into the disappears without that border edge on it. Here we have some Dupion silks and some brocade. This is a synthetic brocade. These are silks. Here we have some fur. We've got some feathers. We've got a few boas here. And I can show you a few tricks about how to sew those on both by hand or by machine. Here is some silk chiffon, very delicate, with a slight pleated grain to it. Here we have a four-way stretch, which is actually a swimwear fabric that I'm going to be working with in the next couple of weeks. So we have to talk about how to stabilize that. And then a selection here of silks. So here we have a crepe de chine, which is a really nice fabric to work with because it's quite stable on both the straight and the cross grains. But I'm going to be teaming it up with a silk satin, and this has a different kind of fluidity and effect. So you can imagine this under stage lighting. It just looks glorious. Underneath these two layers, of course, we're going to use a cupra lining. Why viscose? It's a synthetic fabric, but it's perfect because it has a nice cool temperature, it does not generate heat, and it's breathable. So combining silks and synthetics. Here we have an ombre. Again, this is a synthetic fabric, and it goes from kind of a pink to a peachy and then to the violet spectrum. And that has great effect on the stage. Here we have a Lorex, a metallic fabric that has a metallic thread knitted in. So some of the things that you have to worry about with this is that it tends to curl and it needs stabilizing. And down here I have just a remnant of fabric that I'm working with now, just finishing off an Elizabethan bridal gown. And you can see how this particular fabric pleats and works beautifully and holds a posture. So here I have a strap, a shoulder strap, which was sewn in a large 1.5-inch rouleau, and I've pressed the seam off the edge to the inside, and then I've secured it with a double stitch over a linen tape for stability and the long-term life you need. And next I want to talk to you about working with beads. So let's have a look at how we can control some beaded fabric. So let's just quickly look at 3 different types of beaded fabric that I have on hand here. The first one, because it's sewn in parallel rolls, you could probably get away with cutting a very straight design, very few pieces, not too complicated, and then you can machine it by using a zipper foot and then just using the space between these lines. So that might work out very well. Something else to worry about when you're working with beaded lace is that when you put the right sides together to sew your garment, you do risk beads catching on each other. So the trick I like to use is to just put a few pieces of tissue paper between your work once you get everything cut, and then you can sew your seam and then just peel away the tissue paper when you're done. Another quick trick, if you don't have an all-over beaded pattern, here's a small little bodice, And if you decided that you wanted your placement to be, say, something like this, well, you've got, looking at your seam lines here now, you've got very close to the seam edge, you've got some sequins and a few short bugle beads. You also have them down here at the waistline. So you can carefully remove these with a pair of pointed scissors and a tweezer. And then when you do that, make sure that on the underside that you secure any threads that you've disturbed. So as you can see, here's one of your threads. There's one of your threads there that connects the beads. So you have to be very careful to re-tie those off. Okay? And then finally, here is my next project. This is a magnificent piece of beaded, all over beaded fabric, which has a combination of 3D embroidery and 3D use of fabric. Here's a corresponding chiffon. And it also has this beautiful scalloped edge. And on the underside you can see how this is all put together with this meandering thread that actually has great order, even though it doesn't look like it, because they're working in patches. A lot of people tell you to set this up, look at your seam line, and get a hammer and pound the beads away, and I never do that. I don't like that technique. It's dangerous, it puts shards of glass everywhere. You risk, because you're chopping a bead, you do risk that sharp edge cutting a thread. It can happen. And your studio is going to be a mess with particles of glass. So what I do is I take my fabric and I finish off the edge either with a hand overcast, or you can use a fray check, a glue, and then I sew my seam in a careful back stitch, double thread that's waxed, and then there is my seam. It's all finished. I haven't pounded anything out, you know, there's no bits of shard glass laying around, and there's a nice seam which now you can take your finished edge, and if you wanted to do a very delicate zigzag pick-up stitch, you can pick up some of the threads or even some of the beads to make it very sturdy. And there's nothing wrong with that. This is the technique that I like to use. So there we are. There's a few tips on how to control beaded fabrics. If you're working with fur or suede, you're going to have a selection of skins to work with from which you cut your original pieces. So if you're making a fur coat, you're going to have sleeves, collar, you're going to have a forepart, and you're going to have a back. And you would never cut fur from the top. Now, I'm going to talk about this using this piece, which is a restoration project, and this is a fur stole. Now, to prepare the fur stole, what they've done is they've put this interlining, this padded interlining, on the skin side down before they applied their lining. So if this was an original piece of fabric, what you would do to cut your shapes is you would make, working from the underside, from the skin side, you would make a small hole, and then you would cut your shape just from the skin, keeping the fur away. So you would just cut this layer here. Otherwise, you can imagine, if you just cut this, you would just have fur everywhere and you would really mess up the grain. Well, the same principle holds for suede. Always work from the underside. Chalk out or use a pencil line to denote your shapes, and then using a seam ripper or a small knife, carefully cut, lifting the skin away from the fur. Then when you're going to sew a seam, you use the same principle, where you would fold along the seam line, and in this case you're going to have to be working with very small seams, say 1/8 or slightly larger. You pin the fur together, working from the skin side, and then make sure that on the underside your fur is not caught up in there to the best that you can. Then you would sew your seam, and then when the seam is all finished and you turn the work around, then you can pick the fur back out of that seam to the point where you shouldn't be able to see it at all. And just a quick word about feathers. Right, now we have a couple of boas here, an ostrich and one with a mixed feather. And you can feel that there's a there's a core in the middle of this. Okay, where all the feathers are wrapped together. You can feel this cord, and what you can do, let's get a piece of dupion. And when you lay this on your fabric, you can pin it across the core, arranging your feathers, and then working from the underside. You can see that core there. You can just put a set of hand stitches, just a loose tack there, and that will work very well. You can also put these things in the machine and sew a zigzag on them. It's a bit trickier, but you can do it if you don't want to use the hand method. You can put it in the machine and do a very large zigzag stitch, wide and long. But by all means, practice first. Set up a few trials so that you get the effect you want.